the comments. I'm just going to speak about the public-private divide. I think it connects, but it's geared towards just making some distinctions and all for the audience per se, who have different thoughts and approaches to human rights and all that, as opposed to speaking necessarily, to an expert context per se. So I first would start off. I think I think the private-public divide is an important one. I think we all know about it, but it's sometimes is made explicit, but in the last 20, 30 years, or 40 years, I should really say, as austerity and neoliberalism has gained ground, the private, especially in the UK particularly, less so in North America, had the private dimension, relevance of human rights has become more important, or was realized, right, by observers, oftentimes legal scholars, particularly, and the rest of us have oftentimes taken it for granted. The distinction, we kind of know it, but hadn't thought about it. I mean, of course, so I'll talk to that in a very quick way, because we all have to do that. But the first is kind of on the kind of one that's more famous as a distinction, like one of the axes. I mean, I'm just putting three down, but it is important to thinking about the politics of human rights, which is the context or settings for human rights realization, right? And this is the one we all know. I mean, the sort of private sphere, home life, versus things in public domains on the street, and the internet and all that, things that have been discussed for the last bit by everybody here, and from cities like Jerusalem to Alibaba and so on. The second one is something we know, but to clear this other context, which is organizations and agents for abuse of human rights or denial of human rights. And again, something that's gotten a lot of attention lately for unfortunately very relevant reasons, which is, let's say, private institutions like prisons, private schools, versus, let's say, public forums tied to states, governments, and so on. Thinking about it in terms of landlords, banks, private military security, these whole, so the burgeoning of the neoliberal move, which has been to emphasize the private and to use the public in order to emphasize the private, particularly the private of the wealthy and corporate world. These, of course, have become far more salient in our lives, right? They always were there, of course. So, but there's something afoot compared to that age prior, which may be an exceptional age of the development of the welfare Keynesian state and that sort of model, right? Which it kind of became fairly prevalent and seen to be as a norm until into the 70s and then early 80s. So, and the third sector is, and we have, just to say, I mentioned that because we haven't really thought through and are thinking of the nature of human rights in relationship to this, right? So we notice the patterns that, oh my God, human rights is not just a question of me as individual relationship to the state. There are all these private versus public domains or have become far more science. The third one, the actors that provide human rights and protection and advancement, states versus NGOs, so religious organizations, school, social workers, hired labor unions, and so on. That's something particularly in the UK that's been noticed, and it's been noticed in let's say in the States as well to some degree, and I would say in Canada, but particularly in the UK, where obviously the state hires out contracts for that. So, so the questions when we start thinking about how this matters in terms of, yes, things like torture, forced labor, right to privacy, left alone. We know clearly that's very much in the news now, Facebook, Google, and all the things that are taking place. Freedom movement, NGOs, activist states, all that are in play with these domains, like how activist NGOs would be involved with the freedom of movement. And there are all kind of cases, for example, let's say in the States, people that are aiding migrants at the southern border and have been prosecuted as a result. So again, many times they're held in terms of liability. Now, corporations in terms of human rights, and this is where I'll kind of end. I mean, obviously the questions of water, healthcare, as we have broadened out in the United Nations, particularly our understanding of human rights to include rights to education, healthcare, housing, water, sanitation, social security relates to, let's say, pensions, things like that. Rights to work have always been there, but it's certainly broadened out in all kinds of ways. And corporations and the private sector in relation to NGOs have now become central, and oftentimes sometimes they're partnering, but many times they've been in conflict. So the UN system hasn't confronted that. They've added things like poverty as part of human rights since the mid 2000s, but haven't really, thought about what's this going to mean for this world that we're in now, which has, a massive amount of organizational power that relative to the state is, something that our earlier models of human rights developments in the 40s, right, doesn't really, jive with very well. So we have a lot of work to reframing in terms of a praxis around this, as opposed to noticing that it's going on.